take away the toys, what am I? What am I now?
Welcome, friends, new and old. We're gathered this week to discuss Doctor Who, the 60th anniversary. Somehow we're already finished with the third special. This one's entitled The Giggle. Now, if you are new here, there will be some spoilers ahead. If those aren't for you, like, share, subscribe, and check back in after you've watched it. Final warning, on with the show. The Giggle, the final of these three 60th anniversary specials. I've spent some time thinking about it, and I guess I'm here to share my thoughts. So I want to kick things off talking about the pacing, which I think was probably the biggest issue of this episode overall. It was both too crowded with ideas, and didn't spend enough time with any of them. A lot of the ideas in this episode probably could have made up an entire episode in and of themselves, and I think that based on what we saw in these three specials, it was a lot less of a 60th anniversary celebration and more of a celebration of one specific point in time, while also leading to an end and a beginning. But I'll get back to this later. It was more like a very truncated and condensed season. So these three specials were more like, what story could we tell if we were doing an entire season just in 3 60-minute segments? And I think that's why the pacing felt a little wonky, at least to me. So we kicked things off coming out of Event Horizon last week, dropping right into the midst of In the Mouth of Madness, but we don't spend too much time there, and we don't spend too much time in any of the interesting concepts we have here. We kick off with a little commentary on the state of current discourse, online stuff, everybody thinking they're right, blah, 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 all of that stuff. But then we pop back into the past very quickly to deal with the whole beginnings of this Toymaker sending his signal into all of the televisions, which, by the way, how many mystery signals are hidden or embedded in television in the Doctor Who universe? Just in the Revival series, we've dealt with this on several occasions. The most explicit is probably the silence hiding that little transmission in all of the moon landing broadcasts. So by the time of this episode, there are still at least 2 hidden signals going on, even if the rest of them have been cleared up. I digress, that's not really the point, but it does seem interesting that this keeps coming back as a recurring concept. Back in the past, when we're dealing with the pocket dimension of the Toymaker, that's very cool. Conceptually, that's a great idea. We don't spend nearly enough time there. That could have been almost an entire episode in and of itself. This weird funhouse, this weird haunted house, I guess, them trying to navigate, figure that out. I know we kind of did a similar thing last week with the shifting walls on that weird ship, but it's a very interesting concept here that we very quickly kind of solve and get out of. Then we get the fun little puppet show where the Toymaker is sharing the adventures that the Doctor's companions had after he left Donna, and apparently only the female companions till the end of the Moffat era get a reference, because poor Rory and Nardole, nary a mention, and they technically kind of died in the same manner as the rest of the companions, but what am I to do? All the Jodie companions, not referenced whatsoever, but I guess technically none of them really died, so they wouldn't have fit the narrative. I thought that was a neat little thing, but come on, there's at least a couple of companions you could have thrown a bone to. Before we have too much time to really appreciate all of this stuff, poop, we pop back into the future, or I guess the present, and we deal with that little final confrontation with the Toymaker, and inevitably come up with that whole elephant in the room. Before I get to that, all of the unit stuff was very quick and it wasn't given too much weight. It really seemed, at least in my opinion, like they were throwing all of this stuff in there with no exploration, tailor-made so that it was a setup to the upcoming unit spin-off. I believe that's confirmed, or it may just be a rumor at this point, but all of these things they were throwing in there definitely going to be explained in that unit spin-off. I just felt like they very obviously didn't explain things just so that they could leave that exploration for that spin-off. Obviously, Zingo is a thing that's being set up to be explained later on down the line. Just wanted to mention that. I don't entirely know what it's supposed to be, but that's definitely coming. Before we get to the real meat of that reveal in this episode, I do want to talk about Neil Patrick Harris as the Toymaker. I liked his portrayal, however, I wasn't a huge fan of that German accent he was putting on. I know it was supposed to be over the top, I know it was supposed to be borderline offensive, I know all of those things, but when he dropped it early on in the episode, I was definitely hoping there was going to be more of at least a 50-50 where that was kind of the put on, but then he would switch back to that more sinister voice for bigger moments. And he did that throughout the episode, but by and large, that German accent was mostly what he was using. The way he was playing the character kind of seemed like Q from Star Trek, but it also seemed a little bit like the character that James Marsters played in Torchwood, kind of mashed together and combined. I don't know if that's necessarily actually what was intended. Those are just the things that I drew upon, so if that's not the intention, it's just my weird brain making connections that aren't actually there. Overall, I did like his performance, and I don't know if I would like to see him take this character further on down the line, or if he works better as a one-off and maybe someone else would play him in the future if he were to come back, and I think they are teasing the fact that he will come back, but that remains to be seen. I think he did a good job for what they were trying to do, but there were moments that I'm just like, come on, that's a little bit too much. One more thing before we get to that massive reveal: no supersonic in this episode. Like the fact that they're not throwing that in as a MacGuffin, but it does still leave that little question of why he's not using these things, especially after they were introduced in the first special. Okay, up to the big thing everyone was waiting for and then talking about when it went completely not as planned, the bi-generation scene. David Tennant, Ncuti Gatwa are now both the Doctor. They were split in a very anticlimactic way. I do like the way that they did this. I like that it was just kind of a shot right in mid-sentence. There was no grand build-up. It just kind of happened. And had everything gone according to plan, had that resulted in a real usual regeneration, I think that would have been incredibly effective. The way it actually did work out, still pretty effective, just kind of shooting with a laser mid-sentence. But the bi-generation thing introduces so many possible questions, problems, storytelling opportunities. It's very kind of hard to really wrap your head around how this is actually going to work out in the long run. And because of this, some statements have been released after the fact that make it even a little bit more confusing, but I guess it all depends on how things actually work out in the show itself. Because you can say all the things you want behind the scenes, but if none of that actually makes it on screen, it doesn't really count now, does it? After everything's wrapped up with the Toymaker, we now find out that Ncuti is going on as the main Doctor, which we all knew as the 15th Doctor, I guess, although the numbering system is completely out the window, not only with the Timeless Child stuff, but with all this bi-generation stuff reverberating back through time. It's really more of just a sequential actor thing now than it is an in-universe count. We now keep David Tennant as the 14th Doctor at the same time. Instead of going off through the universe on these grand adventures, he's going to stay on Earth with Donna and her family, and I guess Mel as well, and kind of just live this more normal life, heal himself from all the running the Doctor's been doing since basically the beginning of the show, and just become more grounded, become more of a healed person, I guess you could say. And we see this in Ncuti kind of saying, oh, we're doing things out of order. Because you stay behind and you heal yourself, I become the more grounded person I am today. Which is a little bit interesting based on the fact that they bi-generated and they're both kind of existing simultaneously. So does that mean that even while David Tennant is experiencing all of these things, Ncuti is getting those experiences down the line? So does he technically have all of the knowledge of everything this bi-generation version of David Tennant is having? Or is it more of just a grand overall feelings thing and the actual events have to happen before they solidify in his brain? And a lot more uncertainty is really added to this by the fact that Russell T Davies said this is more of a Doctor multiverse. So each time a Doctor regenerates, the original also kind of branches off into another timeline where that Doctor remains the Doctor. But the bi-generation as seen in this episode was not in a multiverse. Now, I suppose you could say the reason for that one is because they were doing all of this kind of outside or right next to the Toymaker's altered reality, so that allowed both of these multiverses to coexist at the same time, and that's why they didn't splinter. They stayed within the same universe. I'm okay with that. This is Doctor Who. You don't need any hard science to explain anything. Just weird mental gymnastics actually make sense within this universe, which is kind of funny because the rules of the universe in the Toymaker's world aren't really logical, so I guess Doctor Who not being logical is 100% on brand. This also leads to further questions, however. If David Tennant is existing on, let's say, present-day Earth, and he's not going to go off-world all that much, that leaves the potential problem of every time there's a significant problem happening in modern-day Earth, which in the Doctor Who universe we know is all the time, especially on shows like Torchwood or the Sarah Jane Adventures. So that leaves the question, if we have spin-offs, Why isn't this version of the Doctor helping out all the time? Maybe he is. For all we know, maybe one of these special spin-offs that we're going to see is a more Earthbound David Tennant Doctor and Donna going about more Earthbound adventures. If that's not the case, however, let's say the main storyline, the main series going on with Ncuti, he comes back to modern-day Earth to solve a problem. That's always going to present the problem of why isn't this other Doctor which coexists with you also helping out in this problem? Kind of similar to the issue you have with, Marvel and DC Universe movies, where this is a Batman movie, and there's this grand threat going on, but we know Superman exists, we know the Flash exists, so why aren't they also coming to help? You're always going to have that little thing in the back of your head of, we know this other super important person exists just around the corner, and they're just not going to show up. So are they always going to need to write an answer for that? I'm probably overthinking something. I'm assuming Russell T Davies has all of these answers, and that's the reason he did it, but it's just leaving all of these questions wide open, and it's allowing for all of this speculation, and I think that's partially the reason it was done. He wants people to get out there and talk about this, to come up with ideas, all of these wrong ideas. It's also conceivable there is no real end game in sight, and these things are just introduced in order to open up new avenues for somebody else to inevitably come in to explore and try to close off on their own. I've talked about the episode and the possible implications, but how did I like the episode? That's more of a mixed bag. I kind of went into this hoping it was going to be a more interconnected thing. Like each special was kind of developing this overarching story. And while I guess you could kind of consider that to be the case as far as the Doctor growing and coming to terms with the old face, coming back and trying to deal with past trauma and all that stuff, none of the things that felt like they were building up to anything went anywhere. The stuff that happened in the Meep episode that seemed like it might be building to something didn't come back here. The meta-crisis energy being let go, as it were, kind of seemed like it was going to be important, like maybe there was some entity out there trying to gain that energy. It didn't come back into play. That storyline mentioned a couple of things which I guess could be setups for further stories, but I thought they were really going to tie into these specials. Last episode had a little bit of crossover, but not much. That little mention that, I invoked superstition at the edge of the known universe, and that's probably what allowed the Toymaker to sneak into this universe to begin with. That was a little tangentially related, but not to the point of being overly explicit, and this episode kind of felt like a split in Doctor Who itself. Not only did the Doctor split, but it kind of felt like they were wrapping up the original run of the show while simultaneously setting up the fresh new start, and I obviously think that was intentional. There's kind of like a fresh start starting from square one, which now makes sense why it's being known as Season 1 when it starts with Ncuti, because he is technically not just a new iteration of the Doctor, but a brand new being who is split off like an amoeba or something. I don't know, that's a weird way to explain it, I suppose. So it's like a fresh new start while also wrapping up the old start, but not killing it off to the point where we know they're still linked, we know they're still connected, we know David Tennant is still alive, and that leads me to, did this ruin the ending we had prior? Did it ruin the ending we had with the Dr. Donna all those years ago by bringing her back and giving her this happily ever after? Did it ruin the ending we had with David Tennant the first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time? By the time the 70th comes around, we could potentially have 4 different David Tennant Doctors kind of teaming up, because we know we have the one who stayed here, we have the original 10th Doctor, we have the Meta-Crisis Doctor, and I guess you could even throw in that alternate universe that was rewound and never happened with Martha Jones in Series 3, was it, I think? When the Master had that S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier, all of that stuff. So you could have an entire Doctor team-up of just David Tennant. I don't think it really ruins those older stories, but we are now definitely in territory where we risk overutilizing certain characters and certain events and certain experience to the point where if this keeps coming back and coming back and coming back, none of what came before is going to have quite as much impact. So while I am glad that we could potentially still explore these characters down the line, I almost hope we don't spend a lot more time with them, just because we'll now degrade the specialness just a little bit more each time. At least it now appears we have some sort of explanation as to how Tom Baker appeared in the 50th anniversary. Even though they weren't directly linked in this episode, it now seems incredibly plausible that that is related to what happened in this episode. Overall, I did enjoy all three specials. I definitely think Wild Blue Yonder was my favorite. I know I'm going to be an outlier on that because the first and third specials had way more emotional impact and just finality to ongoing storylines, but that was probably my favorite standalone story because it didn't have all these ties and expectations attached to it. It was just a fun kind of creepy storyline in and of itself, and I think that's really what's going to stand the test of time a little bit more as far as rewatchability. As always, a lot of the things that were set up in this episode are definitely going to be very dependent on what comes next. Is the follow-up actually going to take them and run with them, or is it going to let them fall flat? And that will eventually be the real way to come back and test this episode. How well things were paid off, or was this just a standalone thing that was left by the wayside? What were your thoughts? Did you like this episode? Are you excited for the new future of Doctor Who? What do you think of all the big reveals? I know I'm late to the game, but leave all those things down below. Like, share, subscribe, do all those YouTube things. But until next time,
it's not about me.
Yes, it is.